Peppa Pig, the White Wolf and Evie. A sense of unease settled over the pig household, something that no one dared to speak aloud. It all started subtly. The first few nights, Peppa would wake up to a strange sound. Maybe the wind was rustling in the trees, or perhaps claws were scraping across the floor. When she opened her eyes, it seemed like a shadow was moving in the corner of the room. But as soon as she blinked, the shadow was gone. One night, Peppa woke up with a sense of cold. Moonlight streamed through the window, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The white wolf. He stood still, head held high, his fur glowing in the dark as if he was woven from the very light of the moon. The wolf didn't growl or move. He just stared. His breath was heavy, burning cold. The next morning, Peppa told her parents, but they just smiled and said she must have dreamed it. Mummy Pig patted her on the head and said, "You were just scared of the dark." But deep inside, Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. With each passing night, the wolf's presence grew more insistent. At first, he glided across the walls as a shadow. Then his silhouette appeared by their bed. Peppa felt his breath touch her cheek. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of claws scraping the wooden floor. George would toss and turn in his sleep, mumbling, but when he woke, he couldn't remember anything. Then Peppa noticed that the wolf wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small crib by the wall where little Evie slept. Normally, the baby slept peacefully, but now she often cried in the middle of the night. Her tiny body trembled, and it seemed like she felt the presence of the wolf more than anyone. One night, Peppa saw the wolf's eyes glow red. He stood right by Evie's crib, his muzzle lowering towards her face. The baby suddenly woke up and cried, but his gaze never left her. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice stuck in her throat. She ran to her parents, but they were sleeping so deeply, as if they had been enchanted. Days passed, and Evie changed. She stopped crying at night, but that was even scarier. She lay still, her eyes wide open, and her face had turned pale, as if drained of life. When Peppa looked into her eyes, it seemed like they were empty, glassy, and the baby was staring right through her. Peppa tried to convince Mum and Dad that something was wrong, but they just shook their heads. Sometimes at night, she heard them murmuring in their sleep. The words were soft, but she could swear they were repeating the same whisper, a distant howl. "He's waiting! He's waiting!" Then came the morning that changed everything. Peppa woke up and saw that Daddy Pig's bed was empty. His glasses lay on the nightstand, and the blanket was neatly folded. On the pillow was a piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Don't search for me. I'm with him now." Mummy Pig read the note and turned pale. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply sat down on a chair and stared at the wall for a long time. George didn't understand, but Peppa felt a chill spreading inside her. That night, everything became clearer. The room was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The moonlight shone brightly, and its light fell directly on Evie's crib. There beside her sat the white wolf. His fur shimmered and his eyes glowed with a dull red flame. But the most terrifying thing was his smile, his muzzle twisted into a cruel, inhuman grin. Peppa stared at him, unable to move. The wolf wasn't in a hurry. He just sat next to Evie, as if waiting for her turn. Then his gaze slowly shifted to Peppa. She felt her heart tighten. In that moment, she understood. He would come for her too. Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, Peppa and Lucy. Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him, "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. I'll count to 100, you hide. Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices. Even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if 2 more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words. with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. An ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's house. Rain drummed on the roof. The wind pushed heavy clouds across the sky, and inside there was that same cozy silence that usually brought comfort. The family gathered in the living room. Daddy Pig leafed through his newspaper. Mummy Pig was knitting. George played with his dinosaur, and Peppa was building a tower of blocks. Everything looked normal, but Peppa couldn't shake off a strange sense of unease. She noticed it first. The light in the room flickered, the lamp dimmed for a moment, and the shadows on the walls stirred. At first it seemed like nothing more than the wind and the storm outside. But a minute later, the shadows changed again. They stretched longer than they should have and began to move on their own, no longer tied to the people in the room. "Something's wrong with the lamp," muttered Daddy Pig, getting up and fiddling with the switch. But the light burned steadily. Only the shadows moved freely. They twisted, intertwined, and became more and more distorted. Shapes appeared on the walls that shouldn't exist. Crooked arms with unnaturally long fingers, twisted faces, grimacing mouths. "Mummy," whispered Peppa. "It's fine, darling," Mummy Pig quickly replied, but her voice trembled and her hands shook so badly that the knitting slipped from her lap. George whimpered, clutching his dinosaur to his chest. Even his toy cast a shadow that twitched oddly, moving differently than the dinosaur itself, as if alive. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, and each tick thudded like a chill in Peppa's chest. The shadows kept growing, stretching toward the ceiling, the floor, the children. And then one of them separated. It swelled larger than the rest, filling half the room. Its shape was uneven, like smoke given form. Two red points flared where its eyes should be. The figure leaned forward, and from its mouth came a deep, drawn-out growl. "Daddy!" whispered Peppa. But Daddy Pig didn't move. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling, yet no words came. Mummy Pig gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. The creature advanced, its clawed arms stretched toward Peppa, reaching closer and closer. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. And then something stirred on the shelf. Labubu. His glass eyes lit up red. The toy that had always sat motionless suddenly came alive. Slowly, he jumped down. His tiny feet touched the floor softly, yet the sound echoed as if he were far heavier than he looked. He stood directly in front of Peppa. His smile widened, twisted, almost monstrous. The creature froze, its red eyes locked with Labubu's. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rain against the windows. Then, from Labubu's little hands, a stream of thick black energy burst forth. It surged toward the shadow creature, colliding with it like lightning. The air trembled, filled with the smell of damp earth and burning at once. The creature hissed, its body jerking violently, tearing apart piece by piece. It reached toward Labubu with its claws, but he only lifted his gaze, and his glowing eyes flared so brightly that Peppa flinched, nearly blinded. A piercing scream rang out, so sharp it rattled her ears. The shadow writhed as if being ripped apart, and with a final hiss dissolved into nothing. The family sat in stunned silence. George no longer cried. He only clutched his dinosaur tightly, his eyes wide with terror. Mummy and Daddy Pig sat pale and shaken, unable to comprehend what they had seen. Labubu stood on the floor, his glowing red eyes slowly dimmed. His smile softened, turned back into its familiar, innocent curve. He looked once more like an ordinary toy, but Peppa knew he wasn't. She stared at him, feeling deep down that he hadn't just saved them. He had enjoyed it. His smile, even when gentle again, no longer looked harmless. The shadows on the walls never completely disappeared. They still writhed faintly, but quieter now, calmer, almost as if obeying something. Peppa turned to Labubu. He was already back on the shelf. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes faintly glimmering in the darkness, following the movements of every remaining shadow. And his smile widened just a little more. Peppa hugged George tightly and realized this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. It was very early in the morning when Peppa first heard it. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed when a soft, rhythmic knocking came from her bedroom door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard a voice, monotone and strange, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Tun, tun, tun, sahur." Peppa sat up in her bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Who's there?" she called out, but the knocking continued. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," came the voice again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and Peppa slowly approached the door. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing in the hallway was a strange yellow creature with large round eyes and a wooden stick in its hand. The creature looked at Peppa with those unblinking eyes and said just one word, "Sahur." Before Peppa could ask any questions, the creature turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Peppa closed the door quickly, her heart pounding, but sleep would not come again that night. The next morning at breakfast, Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange visitor. "Mummy, Daddy, someone came to my room this morning. They were knocking and saying tun 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 sahur," she explained excitedly. Daddy Pig just laughed. "Peppa, you must have been dreaming. Sahur is just a morning meal that some people have. Your imagination is getting the better of you." Mummy Pig nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear, don't make up scary stories. Now eat your breakfast." But just as they were talking, a rhythmic tapping sound came from outside the house. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" Peppa jumped up from her chair. "Do you hear that?" "That's him!" she cried. The family listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Later that day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when the yellow creature appeared again. It emerged from behind the bushes, still carrying its wooden stick, and began walking slowly around their yard. "Tun, tun, tun," it said monotonously, tapping the stick against the ground with each word. George hid behind Peppa, frightened by the strange visitor. Peppa, though scared, tried to be brave. "What do you want?" she asked. The creature stopped and looked at her. It held out its stick, offering it to Peppa. "Sahur," it said simply. Peppa didn't take the stick. She watched as the creature continued its slow walk around the garden, tapping and chanting its mysterious phrase. That night, Peppa had terrible nightmares. She dreamed she was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dozens of yellow creatures, all carrying sticks and chanting "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" in perfect unison. When she woke up in a cold sweat, she looked out her window and saw the creature standing in the garden, staring up at her room. Days passed, and something strange began happening to Peppa's family. They became quiet and listless. Every morning they would sit at the breakfast table in complete silence, eating their food without speaking, then drift apart to their rooms like sleepwalkers. One morning, Peppa watched in horror as Daddy Pig picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against the table. "Tun, tun, tun," he said in the same monotone voice as the creature. Soon, Mummy Pig joined in, and then George, all of them tapping and chanting together. The final morning came when Peppa ran outside, desperate to escape the strange behavior of her family. But what she saw in the garden made her blood run cold. The entire yard was filled with yellow creatures, all holding wooden sticks. In the center stood her family, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George, each holding a stick of their own. They all turned to look at Peppa with blank, emotionless eyes. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," They chanted in unison, their voices blending with those of the creatures around them. One of the yellow beings approached Peppa and held out a wooden stick. Peppa looked at her transformed family, then at the stick being offered to her. She realized there was no escape, no way back to the life she once knew. Slowly, with trembling hands, Peppa reached out and took the stick. "Sahur," she whispered, her voice already beginning to match the monotone of the others. And so Peppa joined her new family, walking slowly around the garden with the yellow creatures, tapping her stick and chanting the endless phrase that had consumed them all. The morning ritual had claimed another victim, and somewhere in the distance the sound of "tun tun tun sahur" continued to echo, waiting for the next family to find. The night was unusually quiet. Outside the window, there were no stars, no moon, only a dense darkness in which everything seemed to dissolve. Peppa Pig's house had fallen silent on its own. Even the kitchen clock had stopped ticking, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against their ears. Peppa woke up suddenly, as if someone had touched her shoulder. She sat up in bed and listened to George's breathing. It was too even, too quiet. Her brother slept, tightly clutching his dinosaur. But then, from the parents' room next door, came a sound. A low, drawn-out groan mixed with a creaking noise. Peppa held her breath. She hadn't wanted to wake George, but he opened his eyes himself and looked at her. His face was pale. He had heard it too. Carefully, they got out of bed and, trying to walk silently, stepped into the hallway. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker coming from under their parents' door. That was where the strange sound was coming from. Peppa squeezed George's little paw. The door was slightly ajar. She nudged it open just a little and peeked inside. What they saw froze their hearts. On the bed sat a creature that resembled their parents, yet was entirely alien. Its body looked as if it had been stitched from two halves. One part, Mummy Pig, the other, Daddy Pig. Two heads protruded side by side, but the eyes in both faces were utterly empty. They reflected no light, no life, only two bottomless black voids. Identical, wide smiles stretched across both faces. The creature turned toward the children, the two heads tilted at the same time. With that movement, the very air seemed to change pressure. It became harder to breathe. Peppa stepped back, but her legs refused to obey. George clutched her paw tightly, but he too seemed rooted to the floor. The creature stretched its arms toward them. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. The room reeked of dampness and rot. Mama, whispered Peppa. But in that moment she knew it was not their parents. Their bodies began moving on their own. Slowly, step by step, they walked toward the thing. Their hearts pounded, but there was no strength left to resist. The creature waited. Its two mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, but no sound came out. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. And then, from behind it, from the very shadow, he appeared. Labubu. Peppa recognized his silhouette instantly, her favorite toy, the one that always sat on the shelf. But now, he was alive. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the dark, and on his face was a smile so wide and crooked it looked as though the fabric would split. In his paws, he held a doll. Small, ragged, and horribly familiar. A copy of Peppa herself. Even the dress was the same pink, only stained with dark blotches. Slowly, Labubu began to pull at the doll's head. The fabric stretched, and a sickening tearing sound filled the air. The two-headed creature immediately froze, as if awaiting orders. Its empty eyes were fixed on Labubu. It wasn't the master, it was the servant. "No," whispered Peppa, but her voice was too weak. George flinched, his small eyes widening. On the floor beside him lay another doll, an exact copy of George. It had appeared out of nowhere, and its lifeless eyes stared directly at the children. Labubu lifted his gaze. His red eyes met Peppa's. In that instant, she felt the world itself shift. The walls of her parents' bedroom quivered, the ceiling stretched higher, and the door behind her slammed shut on its own. There was no way out. The creature took a step forward, its two heads grinning in the same unnatural smile. But it wasn't moving toward the children. It was moving in rhythm with Labubu. Every tilt of his head, every twitch of his paw was mirrored by the monster. It was the puppet, and Labubu was the puppeteer. Peppa and George screamed, but their voices vanished, swallowed by the air itself. Labubu only smiled wider. He lifted both dolls, the Peppa doll and the George doll, and pressed them together. At that moment, the children felt their own bodies being dragged forward, pulled into the darkness toward the creature. The darkness closed in around them. Peppa had just enough time to see Labubu's red eyes blazing brighter than ever. And then the world was gone. The last thing that remained in her memory was his smile, and the realization that now they themselves had become part of Labubu's collection. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared, doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty, the shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere.